I signed my divorce papers on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday night, a man I had never met in my life looked me in the eyes and called me son. Not sir. Not kid. Son. And the strange part? He wasn't wrong to say it. If you had told me a year ago that the worst day of my life, the day my marriage legally ended, would also be the day I discovered who I actually was, I would have laughed at you. But that's exactly what happened. And by the end of this story, you're going to understand why one piece of paper can end a life you built, and one phone call can hand you a life you never knew was waiting. Stay with me, because this isn't just my story. This is a story about the secrets families keep, the lies that protect us, and the terrifying moment when the truth finally decides it's done waiting. Let's go back to the beginning. My name doesn't matter right now. What matters is that 3 years ago, I was an ordinary guy living an ordinary life in a mid-sized American city, the kind of place with strip malls and Sunday football and neighbors who wave but don't really know you. I had a job in logistics, a modest house with a leaking gutter I kept meaning to fix, and a marriage that, looking back, had been quietly dying for a long time before either of us admitted it out loud. Her name was Rachel. We met in our 20s, married in our late 20s, and spent almost a decade building something that looked, from the outside, like a normal life. Kids' birthday parties for our nephews. Holiday dinners. The occasional vacation we couldn't quite afford. From a distance, it looked fine. But here's something nobody tells you about marriages that fail slowly instead of all at once. You don't notice the exact moment it breaks. There's no dramatic scene, no slammed door, no single betrayal you can point to and say, that's when it ended. It's quieter than that. It's 1,000 small silences stacked on top of each other until one day you realize you're sleeping next to someone you barely recognize. By the time we sat down with lawyers, there was no anger left. Just exhaustion. Just two people who had run out of reasons to keep pretending. I tell you all of this not because the divorce itself is the point of this story, but because you need to understand the state I was in on that Tuesday morning. I was hollowed out. I felt like a man standing in the wreckage of everything he thought his life was supposed to be. What would you do on a day like that? Would you go to work like nothing happened? Would you call a friend? Would you just sit in your car in the parking lot and stare at nothing for 20 minutes, the way I did? I chose the parking lot. I sat there with the engine off, watching people walk in and out of the courthouse, each of them carrying their own invisible weight. And that's when my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. Local area code. I almost didn't answer. Think about this for a second. How many times in your life has a moment that changed everything begun with something as small and unremarkable as, I almost didn't answer the phone? I picked it up. A man's voice, older, calm, with the kind of gravel in it that comes from either cigarettes or decades of giving orders, maybe both. He said my name. Not casually, carefully, like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. I confirmed it was me. And then he said something that made my stomach drop straight through the floor of my car. I've been waiting a long time to say this to you. My name is Salvatore Conti. And you, son, are my grandson. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I certainly couldn't. My grandfather, the one I grew up believing had died before I was born, the one my mother refused to talk about, the one whose name was never spoken at our dinner table, was alive. And according to this stranger on the phone, he wasn't just alive. He was Salvatore Conti, a name that, within 24 hours, I would learn meant something very specific in certain circles of this country. A name connected to organized crime going back 3 generations. But here's where it gets interesting, because the story you're expecting right now is not the story that actually happened. You're probably picturing a Hollywood scene, sudden riches, a criminal empire waiting to be inherited, a dangerous new life of power and violence. And there is some truth buried in that fantasy. But the real story is stranger, sadder, and in some ways far more human than any movie script could invent. Because the truth is, my grandfather wasn't calling to recruit me into a life of crime. He was calling because he was dying, and for the first time in 50 years, he wanted to tell the truth. Let's rewind further, Because to understand why a man like Salvatore Conti spent 5 decades pretending his own daughter didn't exist, you have to understand the world he came from. Salvatore was born in 1943 in a working-class Italian-American neighborhood in the Northeast, the kind of place where family loyalty wasn't just a value, it was survival. His father worked construction. His mother took in sewing. And by the time Salvatore was a teenager, he had already learned the 2 lessons that would define his entire life. Never trust outsiders, and never, under any circumstances, talk to the police. Most people never realize how ordinary the beginning of a life in organized crime actually looks. It's rarely a dramatic recruitment scene. It's usually a series of small favors that grow larger and larger until the person doing them can't remember when saying no was ever an option. For Salvatore, it started with running errands for men in his neighborhood who wore nice suits and drove nicer cars. By 19, he was doing far more than errands. By 30, he had a seat at a table most people don't even know exists. I'm not going to glamorize what came next, because the truth is, that world cost him almost everything that mattered. It cost him his marriage. It cost him relationships with people who loved him. And most devastatingly, it cost him his daughter, my mother. But before I get to that cost, I think it's worth slowing down and actually understanding the shape of the life he built, because without that context, none of what follows makes emotional sense. This is the deep dive I promised you at the start, and I think you'll find it's nothing like the version of this world that shows up in most crime dramas. By his early 30s, Salvatore wasn't a soldier running errands anymore. He had become what people in that world call a made man. Someone formally initiated into the organization, someone whose word carried weight, whose protection extended to the people under him, and whose obligations, in return, became absolute. Historians and journalists who've studied organized crime families describe this initiation less as a single dramatic ceremony and more as a permanent shift in identity. Once you were in, the organization functioned as a second family, one with its own rules, its own hierarchy, and its own unforgiving definition of loyalty. What most people get wrong about this world, the thing Hollywood almost never gets right, is how much of it actually ran on legitimate-looking business. Salvatore, according to what he told me, and what I later confirmed through public records and old newspaper archives, spent much of his career operating through construction companies, trucking businesses, and small commercial real estate deals, the kind of unglamorous, paperwork-heavy enterprises that provided both genuine income and convenient cover. The violence people associate with this world existed, and it was real, and it was devastating to the people caught in it. But for a man like Salvatore, most days looked far more like running a stressful small business than starring in a gangster film. That distinction mattered to him, or at least he insisted it mattered, during the conversations we had in his final months. He wanted me to understand that he saw himself, for most of his life, as a provider first, and everything else second, a man trying to give his family security in the only framework he'd ever been taught. Whether that self-image was accurate or simply the story he needed to tell himself at the end of his life, I honestly can't say with certainty. Grief and guilt have a way of reshaping memory, and dying men are not always reliable narrators of their own history, even when they believe every word they're saying. What I can tell you with more confidence, because I heard it independently from Dominic and from records I found later, is that Salvatore's rise within the organization coincided almost exactly with the years my mother remembers as the most frightening of her childhood, the late 1970s and early 1980s, a period when law enforcement pressure on organized crime families across the country intensified dramatically. New federal statutes, particularly the RICO Act, gave prosecutors powerful new tools to dismantle these organizations from the inside, using conspiracy charges that didn't require proving a specific violent act, only proving a pattern of coordinated criminal activity. For families like mine, that legal shift meant an entirely new kind of fear entered the household. Not just fear of rival organizations, but fear of federal indictment, fear of informants, fear of the walls closing in from every direction at once. My mother remembers whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. She remembers her father disappearing for days at a time with no explanation. She remembers, most vividly, a night when federal agents came to their house with a search warrant, tearing through closets and drawers while she stood in the hallway in her pajamas, 9 years old, watching her mother's face go completely white. Nothing came of that particular search. Salvatore was never charged in connection with it, but the fear it planted in my mother never fully left her. Even decades later, even after she'd built an entirely different life for herself 2,000 miles away. This is the part of the story I think people misunderstand most about families connected to organized crime. It's not the danger itself that does the deepest damage, though the danger is real and shouldn't be minimized. It's the chronic, low-grade uncertainty, never quite knowing which version of your father is coming home tonight. Never being able to explain to a school friend why certain topics are simply off-limits. Never feeling fully safe even inside your own house. Psychologists who study children raised in high-secrecy households describe this as a kind of persistent hypervigilance, a nervous system that never fully learns how to relax, because relaxing has never actually been safe. My mother carried that hypervigilance with her long after she left. She told me, during one of our long conversations that year, that even decades later, she still instinctively scanned every room she entered, still felt a small flicker of panic whenever someone knocked on the door unannounced. She had built an ordinary, quiet life through sheer force of will, but the nervous system underneath that life had been shaped in a house where safety was never guaranteed. That's not something that simply resets once you move away. It's something you manage, carefully, for the rest of your life. Here's the part of the story that took me the longest to understand, and the part one think you need to hear most, because it's the emotional core of everything that happened. My mother, Elena, was born into that world without ever asking for it. She grew up watching her father leave the house at strange hours, watching men she didn't know sit in their living rooms speaking in low voices, watching her mother pretend everything was normal when it clearly wasn't. By the time Elena was a teenager, she understood exactly what her father was, even though nobody ever said the words out loud. And she made a decision that most people never have the courage to make. At 19 years old, she left. Not just left home. She legally changed her surname, moved across the country, and cut every possible connection to the life she came from. She built herself an entirely new identity, layer by layer, brick by brick, specifically so that her children would never have to know the truth she carried. That's how she met my father. That's how I was born into a family that told beautiful, protective lies for my entire childhood. My mother told me my grandfather had died young. She told me she had no surviving family from that side. And she believed, with everything in her, that she was protecting me. Was she wrong to do that? I've asked myself that question more times than I can count, and I still don't have a clean answer. Because here's the myth versus the reality of families like mine. The myth is that secrets protect the people we love. The reality is that secrets simply delay the pain. They don't eliminate it. They just wait, patiently, for the right moment to surface. And for me, that moment was the day my marriage ended. Let's go back to that phone call, because I haven't told you the full truth of what happened in the days that followed, and I promise you, the truth is even more surprising than you're imagining right now. Salvatore asked to meet me in person. Every instinct in my body told me to say no. I had just spent the day dissolving one relationship. The last thing I needed was to insert myself into a family I'd been told my entire life didn't exist, connected to a world I only understood from movies and news headlines. But grief does strange things to a person's judgment. When you've just lost the life you thought you were building, there's a part of you that becomes almost recklessly open to anything that promises a different direction. I said yes. We met 3 days later at a small Italian restaurant that clearly wasn't chosen at random. It was the kind of place where the owner personally greeted him by name, where the back booth was reserved without anyone having to ask, where the staff moved around him with a mixture of respect and something that looked almost like fear. I want to describe him to you honestly, because he was not what I expected. I expected menace. I expected the kind of cold, calculating presence you see in crime dramas. What I got instead was an 81-year-old man with trembling hands, oxygen tubes resting just beneath his nose, and eyes that filled with tears the moment he saw my face. He told me I looked like her, like my mother, like the daughter he hadn't spoken to in almost 40 years. And then, over the course of nearly 3 hours, he told me everything. He told me about the choices he made as a young man that he could never undo. He told me about the moment my mother left and how he had let her go without a fight, because some small, buried part of him believed she was right to run. He told me about the years of silence that followed, years where he tracked her from a distance through private investigators, never once making contact, terrified that reaching out would only drag her back into danger. He told me he had cancer, pancreatic, stage 4, months, not years. And he told me the reason he had finally broken his silence wasn't guilt alone, though there was plenty of that. It was something more specific, more urgent. There were things happening in his world, old debts and older enemies. And before he died, he needed to make sure certain truths were passed on, certain protections were put in place, and certain people, myself included, understood exactly what they might be walking into simply by existing as his blood. Here's where I need to pause the story and be completely honest with you, because I promised you accuracy, not sensationalism. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I suddenly inherited millions of dollars or a criminal empire, because that's not what happened. And frankly, that version of this story exists 1,000 times over in movies that have nothing to do with real life. What actually happened was smaller, quieter, and in many ways far more unsettling. What I inherited wasn't money. It was information. And in certain worlds, information is far more dangerous than cash. Salvatore explained that decades earlier, disputes within his organization had left behind unresolved grievances, the kind that don't expire with time the way debts of money do. Some of the men he had once worked alongside were dead. Some were in prison. But some were still alive, still connected, still capable of viewing any surviving Connie bloodline as either a loose end or a potential target, depending on which old wound you asked them about. He wasn't calling me son to bring me into that world. He was calling me son to warn me that, whether I liked it or not, I was already tangled in threads I never knew existed. Think about that for a moment. How many of us walk through life assuming we understand exactly who we are and where we come from, never realizing that entire chapters of our own history have been deliberately hidden from us, not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate, flawed attempt at protection? This is the hidden truth at the center of so many families, even ones with far less dramatic histories than mine. The stories we're told about our own origins are almost never the complete picture. Parents edit. Parents omit. Parents protect us from versions of the truth they've decided we can't handle. And most of the time, we never find out. We go our whole lives believing an incomplete story, mistaking it for the whole truth. I did find out. And once you find out, you can't unknow it. In the weeks that followed that dinner, my entire understanding of myself began to unravel and rebuild itself at the same time. I started asking my mother questions I had never dared to ask before. At first, she denied everything, out of pure reflex, decades of practice deflection kicking in automatically. But eventually, when she realized I already knew the core of the truth, something in her broke open, and for the first time in my adult life, my mother told me who she really was. She cried more in that one conversation than I had seen her cry in 30 years combined. She told me about the fear she carried every single day of her childhood, never knowing which version of normal life could vanish overnight. She told me about the night she finally decided to leave, sneaking out with a single suitcase while her father was away on what she now believes was business she was never meant to understand. She told me she had spent every year since terrified that one day, the past would find her children the way it had once threatened to consume her. And here's the emotional gut punch of this entire story, the part that I think matters most. She wasn't angry that I knew. She was relieved. 40 years of carrying a secret that heavy, completely alone, and in one conversation, some of that weight finally lifted off her shoulders. Isn't it strange how the things we hide to protect the people we love often end up isolating us from them instead? Before I tell you what happened next, I want to take a step back, because in the weeks after that conversation with my mother, I did something I think a lot of people in my position would do. I went looking for answers outside my own family. I wanted to understand the world my grandfather came from, not to romanticize it, but to actually make sense of the decisions that had shaped 3 generations of people I loved. What I learned surprised me, and I think it will surprise you too, because the reality of organized crime families is almost nothing like what television has trained us to expect. Most people picture organized crime as constant violence, constant danger, a life lived permanently on the edge of a gun barrel. The truth, according to the researchers, journalists, and even retired law enforcement officials I spoke with while trying to understand my own history, is far quieter and far more mundane. For most people connected to that world, life looked almost boring on the surface. Grocery runs, school recitals, Sunday Mass. The violence, when it happened, was the exception, not the rule, a last resort in a system built primarily on relationships, loyalty, and silence. That silence has a name. In Sicilian, it's called omerta, a code of silence so deeply ingrained that even victims of violence within these communities would refuse to identify their attackers to police. Sociologists who study organized crime describe omerta less as a rule and more as a survival instinct passed down like a family trait. Break it, and you don't just risk your own safety. You risk the safety of everyone who shares your last name. Understanding that code helped me understand my grandfather in a way I couldn't have otherwise. He wasn't simply choosing loyalty to criminals over loyalty to his daughter. In his mind, distorted as it may have been, silence was the only form of protection he knew how to offer her. He genuinely believed that the less she knew, the safer she would be. He was wrong about almost everything else in his life, but he wasn't entirely wrong about that. Here's where the psychological insights of this story really start to matter, because what happened in my family is not as rare as you might think. Family therapists who specialize in what's called family systems theory will tell you that secrets don't just disappear when they go unspoken. They get absorbed into the emotional architecture of a family, passed down not through words, but through behavior. Children raised by parents carrying unspoken trauma often report a strange, persistent feeling that something is being kept from them, even when they can't identify what it is. That feeling has a name too. Psychologists sometimes call it the family ghost, the presence of an untold story that shapes a household's emotional temperature without ever being directly acknowledged. Looking back on my own childhood, I can see it now. The way my mother's face would tighten slightly whenever anyone asked about her side of the family. The way certain subjects were redirected so smoothly, I never even noticed I'd been steered away from them. The way, "we don't really talk about that," became a phrase so familiar I stopped questioning it entirely. Most people never realize they've been trained to stop asking questions until, like me, something forces the pattern to break. There's a term in psychology for what I experienced in the weeks after that first phone call, something researchers who study family secrets call identity disorientation. It's the disorienting emotional experience of realizing that the story you've been told about who you are doesn't match the story that's actually true. It's not quite grief, though grief is part of it. It's not quite betrayal, though that's in there too. It's closer to standing on ground you always assumed was solid, only to discover it was hollow the whole time. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it's important, and because I promised you this story wouldn't be sanitized for the sake of a clean narrative. In the first 2 weeks after learning the truth, I made almost every mistake a person can make when confronted with a sudden, destabilizing family revelation. The first mistake I made was trying to process everything alone. I didn't tell my closest friends. I barely spoke to anyone outside of my mother and, eventually, my grandfather. I convinced myself that carrying this weight privately was somehow safer, more responsible, more mature. In reality, isolating myself only made the disorientation worse. Trauma researchers consistently point out that secrecy compounds distress. The very thing that made my grandfather's silence so damaging to my mother was quietly starting to damage me the same way, just on a compressed timeline. The second mistake I made was assuming that learning the truth meant I had to immediately decide how I felt about it. I put enormous pressure on myself to arrive at some neat emotional conclusion: forgiveness, anger, acceptance, something I could package into a clean narrative for myself. What I eventually learned, partly through conversations with a therapist I finally worked up the courage to see, is that sudden identity revelations don't resolve on a schedule. Grief counselors who specialize in this exact kind of disorientation, sometimes called ambiguous loss, a term originally used to describe the grief of losing someone who is physically present but psychologically absent, like in cases of dementia, say the healthiest path forward isn't rushing toward resolution. It's allowing the complexity to exist without forcing it into a tidy shape. The third mistake, and maybe the most human one, was that I initially tried to rewrite my entire childhood through this new lens, retroactively suspecting hidden meaning in every ordinary memory. Was that strange phone call when I was 12 connected to this? Was that unexplained trip my mother took the summer before I started high school somehow related? Therapists call this retrospective reconstruction, and while a certain amount of it is a natural part of processing new information, taken too far, it can become its own kind of distortion, replacing one incomplete story with another one built on speculation rather than fact. If you're someone who has ever uncovered an unexpected truth about your own family, an unknown sibling, a hidden adoption, a parent's secret first marriage, anything that cracked open the story you thought you knew, I want you to hear this clearly, because it's the piece of expert advice that helped me the most. Genealogists and family therapists who work specifically with people navigating these kinds of revelations recommend a few concrete steps, and I want to walk you through them, because they genuinely help me find solid ground again. First, separate the fact-finding from the emotional processing. Give yourself permission to gather information at your own pace without requiring yourself to have an emotional reaction ready at every step. You don't have to feel something profound the moment you learn a new fact. Sometimes the feelings arrive days or even weeks later, and that delay doesn't mean you're processing it wrong. Second, find at least one person you trust enough to say the truth out loud to, even if it's just once. Secrets lose some of their psychological weight the moment they're spoken aloud to someone who receives them without judgment. For me, that person eventually became a close friend from college, someone who had no connection to my family history and therefore no stake in how I processed it. Saying the words "my grandfather was involved in organized crime" out loud to someone who simply listened did more for my mental clarity than weeks of silent rumination. Third, resist the urge to assign a single, simple verdict to the people involved. Human beings are rarely purely villains or purely victims, and family secrets almost always involve people who were simultaneously harmed and harmful, protective and destructive, loving and deeply flawed. Therapists describe this as holding complexity, the ability to say, "This person hurt people, and this person also loved me," without needing one truth to cancel out the other. Fourth, and this one surprised me the most when I first heard it from the therapist I eventually started seeing regularly. Give yourself explicit permission to grieve the version of your life you thought you had, even if the new version isn't objectively worse. I wasn't just grieving a hidden grandfather. I was grieving the simpler, quieter story I had believed about my own family for 30-some years. That story wasn't true, but it was mine, and losing it, even in favor of a truer story, still counted as a loss worth acknowledging. If you're watching this and something in your own life feels a little too familiar, an unexplained silence in your family, a relative nobody talks about, a story that's never quite added up, I want you to know that curiosity isn't betrayal. Wanting to understand where you come from doesn't mean you're rejecting the people who raised you. It usually means the opposite. It means you love your story enough to want the real one. Let's talk about what happened next, because the story doesn't end with a tearful family reunion and a fade to black. Real life rarely wraps up that neatly, and this situation was no exception. Salvatore, despite his failing health, insisted on formally introducing me to a small handful of people from his past, not to pull me into anything active, but specifically to make sure that if certain names ever surfaced in my life, I would understand exactly who I was dealing with and why caution mattered. This wasn't a movie initiation scene with dramatic oaths and secret handshakes. It was closer to a dying man frantically trying to hand his grandson a map to a minefield before it was too late to warn him at all. One of those meetings terrified me more than anything else in this entire experience. A man named Dominic, older than my grandfather, someone who had known my family for over half a century, looked at me across a table and said something I will never forget. Your grandfather made choices most men never have to make. You don't have to understand them to respect what they cost him. At the time, I thought that was a strange thing to say. Looking back now, I think it might be the truest sentence anyone said to me during that entire chapter of my life. I want to pause here and tell you that my story, as strange as it sounds, is far from the only one like it. Once I started quietly researching how common these kinds of hidden family histories actually are, I realized something that honestly changed how I see almost everyone around me. Genealogy researchers who work with DNA testing services have reported, over and over, a consistent pattern. A meaningful percentage of people who take an at-home DNA test uncover something they didn't expect: an unknown half-sibling, a biological father who isn't the man who raised them, an entire branch of family history that had been deliberately erased. These companies didn't design their tests to become confession machines for old family secrets. But that's exactly what they've become for thousands of ordinary people. Think about that for a second. You could be sitting next to someone right now, a coworker, a neighbor, a friend you've known for years, who is quietly carrying the exact same kind of disorientation I carried. They just haven't said it out loud. Most people don't, because there's a strange, unspoken shame attached to discovering your family isn't who you thought they were, even though none of it was ever your fault to begin with. I spoke to a woman during this process, a distant family friend introduced to me by Dominic, who had gone through something similar decades earlier, discovering in her 30s that her father's import-export business was, in reality, a front connected to a very different kind of network entirely. She told me something I still think about constantly. She said, "The hardest part was never the truth itself. The hardest part was realizing how much energy my whole family had spent building a wall around it. Energy that could have gone into just living." That sentence hit me harder than almost anything Salvatore ever said to me directly, because it reframed the entire tragedy of my mother's silence. It wasn't just that she hid a fact from me. It's that hiding it cost her decades of quiet, exhausting vigilance. Decades of carefully managing what could and couldn't be said, who could and couldn't be trusted, which questions had to be redirected before they got too close to the truth. Secrets, I learned, don't just weigh on the person who eventually discovers them. They weigh, often more heavily, on the person who has to carry them every single day until the day they're finally set down. This is the part of the story where I want to be genuinely useful to you, because if you've made it this far, there's a good chance something about this resonates with your own life, even if the specifics are completely different. Maybe there's no mafia in your family history. Maybe it's something else entirely, an estranged relative nobody explains, an adoption that was never fully discussed, a divorce in a previous generation that gets mentioned in whispers, and nothing more. The emotional mechanics are almost always the same, even when the details change. So here are the actionable tips I wish someone had handed me on that first Tuesday, sitting in my car outside the courthouse, phone buzzing with a number I almost didn't answer. If you suspect there's a hidden truth in your own family, start by paying attention to the physical reactions of the people around you, not just their words. My mother never lied to my face about having no living family. Technically, in her own understanding, she believed she was protecting me with a kind of true enough silence rather than an outright lie. But her body always told a different story than her words did. The tension in her shoulders whenever the subject came close. The slight change in her breathing. Family secrets almost always leave physical fingerprints, even when the verbal story stays perfectly consistent. Next, if you do decide to pursue the truth, do it with patience rather than urgency. I made the mistake early on of wanting answers immediately, of pushing my mother for details before she was emotionally ready to give them. Therapists who specialize in family disclosure will tell you that forcing a revelation before someone is ready to share it rarely produces the whole truth. It usually produces a defensive, incomplete version designed to end the conversation as quickly as possible. The full truth came to me in layers, over weeks, not in one single dramatic conversation, no matter how much the version of events in my head wanted it to happen all at once. Third, document what you learn, even informally. I started keeping a private journal during this period, not for anyone else to read, just for myself, to keep the timeline straight as new details emerged. This turned out to be more valuable than I expected, because identity disorientation has a strange effect on memory. You start doubting details you were once completely certain about. Having a written record helped me trust my own understanding of events as the picture kept expanding. Fourth, and this is the piece of advice that took me the longest to actually accept, you are allowed to keep some emotional distance from a truth, even after you know it. Learning about my grandfather's history didn't obligate me to feel a specific way about him, to forgive him, to condemn him, or to integrate his world into my own identity in any particular way. Knowledge and emotional resolution are two separate processes, and you're allowed to have one without immediately having the other. And finally, if you're navigating something like this right now, please don't do it entirely alone. I know I already mentioned the importance of talking to someone, but I want to say it again, more directly this time, because it matters that much. Whether it's a therapist, a trusted friend, a support group for people processing unexpected family discoveries. And yes, those exist, more commonly than you'd think. Carrying a revelation like this in complete isolation will cost you far more than the discomfort of simply saying it out loud to someone safe. I didn't follow all of this advice perfectly. Nobody does. But every piece of it made the process a little more survivable, and I hope, if you ever find yourself standing where I stood, it does the same for you. But I haven't told you about the one moment in this entire story that genuinely frightened me. The moment that made all of this feel less like a family drama and more like something with real, physical stakes. About 6 weeks after that first dinner with Salvatore, I noticed a car parked outside my apartment building that I didn't recognize, sitting there for close to 2 hours on a weekday evening. I told myself it was nothing. People park on residential streets all the time. But something about it nagged at me, and when I mentioned it, almost as a passing comment, during my next visit with Salvatore, his entire demeanor changed. He asked me to describe the car in detail. Color, make, whether I could see the driver, how long it stayed. I watched a man who had spent that entire visit looking frail and tired suddenly snap into a version of himself I hadn't seen before. Sharp, focused, asking questions with the precision of someone who had spent decades assessing threats before they became disasters. He told me, carefully, that it was probably nothing. And then, in the next breath, he told me it might not be. There were men from his past, he explained, who had never fully let go of old grievances, disputes over territory and money that predated my birth by decades, but that in certain circles, apparently, never truly expire. He explained that simply being his blood, even blood that had been hidden for 40 years, might be enough to make me a point of interest to people who operated by a very different set of rules than the ones I was used to. I won't pretend that conversation didn't terrify me. For about a week afterward, I found myself doing exactly what my mother had described doing her entire life. Glancing at parked cars a little too long, feeling my pulse spike at unexpected knocks on the door, wondering if ordinary strangers were watching me for reasons I couldn't see. It was a small, temporary taste of the hypervigilance she'd carried for decades, and it gave me a level of empathy for her that no amount of storytelling alone could have provided. Nothing ever came of it. Dominic looked into it quietly on Salvatore's request and reported back that the car most likely belonged to a visiting relative of a neighbor 2 doors down, an almost anticlimactic explanation after days of genuine fear. But Salvatore didn't treat the false alarm as a reason to relax. If anything, it convinced him even more urgently that his remaining time needed to be spent making sure I understood exactly what I might be connected to, whether I wanted the connection or not. That week taught me something I don't think I could have learned any other way. The fear my mother carried for decades wasn't paranoia. It wasn't an overreaction to a threat that no longer existed. It was a rational, learned response to a world where the past genuinely doesn't stay in the past, where old debts and old enemies can resurface decades later, attached to people who never even knew they existed until a phone call changed everything. Understanding that fear from the inside, even briefly, changed how I understood every guarded, careful choice my mother had ever made. Because here's the biggest lesson I took from all of this, the one thing I want you to walk away from this video actually thinking about, long after you've closed this tab and moved on with your day. We spend so much energy judging people based on the worst chapters of their lives, without ever asking what it cost them to survive those chapters in the first place. My grandfather made devastating choices. He hurt people. He was part of a world that caused real, lasting harm. I'm not here to excuse any of that, and I want to be completely clear about that. But he was also a human being capable of love, capable of regret, capable of spending his final months trying, imperfectly and far too late, to make something right. People are rarely just one thing. The villain in someone else's story is very often the protector, the provider, or the desperate parent in their own. That doesn't erase the damage. It just means the truth is more complicated than the labels we like to put on people. Salvatore Conti died 4 months after that first phone call. I was there, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and quiet endings, holding a hand that had once, decades earlier, made decisions that rippled through generations of a family he barely knew. The last few weeks of his life were slower than I expected, and stranger than I expected too. Cancer, especially the kind he had, doesn't move in a straight line toward the end. There were days he seemed almost like himself, sharp, funny in a dry, old-world way, telling stories about his own father that made me laugh despite everything. And there were days the pain medication pulled him somewhere far away, somewhere I couldn't follow, where he'd mumble names I didn't recognize and apologize to people who weren't in the room. I visited him every week during those 4 months, sometimes with my mother, sometimes alone. Those solo visits became some of the strangest, most important hours of my life. Without her there, he spoke more freely, almost like he was trying to compress 50 years of unspoken thoughts into whatever time he had left. He told me about the year he almost left the organization entirely, in his 40s, and the conversation with his own mentor that convinced him it was already too late to walk away safely. He told me about a woman he'd loved before he married my grandmother, someone he let go because staying with her would have put her in danger. He told me, more than once, that the single greatest regret of his life wasn't any specific violent act, any specific business decision gone wrong. It was the silence itself. The 40 years of choosing distance because he genuinely believed it was safer than presence. I thought I was protecting her by disappearing. He told me one afternoon, his voice barely above a whisper, oxygen tube hissing softly beside him. I didn't understand until it was too late that disappearing is its own kind of wound. Maybe a worse one. I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't know what the right response would have been. I just sat there and let him say it, because I think, more than absolution, more than forgiveness, what he actually needed in those final weeks was simply a witness. Someone who would hear the whole truth and not look away. The final visit was different from all the others. My mother came with me that day, and something had shifted in her by then. Not forgiveness exactly. She was always careful to correct me when I used that word, but something adjacent to it. A willingness to be present without needing the presence to mean everything was suddenly fine. He was barely conscious for most of that last visit, drifting in and out. But there was a moment, maybe 10 minutes, maybe less, where his eyes cleared and he recognized both of us standing there together. He looked at my mother for a long time without saying anything. And then he said her name, just her first name, the way you might say a word you'd been afraid to lose. Elena. She took his hand. Neither of them said much else. Some conversations don't need words to matter. They just need presence. And after 40 years of absence, presence was the only apology that could possibly have been enough. He passed early the next morning. My mother was there too. It was the first time she had seen her father's face in almost 40 years, and it was also the last. She told me afterward that despite everything, despite the anger, the fear, the decades of silence, some small part of her was grateful she got to say goodbye. Grief and relief, it turns out, can occupy the exact same moment in time. Here's what I want you to take from this, especially if you've ever felt like your own family history has gaps in it that don't quite add up. Especially if you've ever sensed that there's a story underneath the story you were told growing up. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to want the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when the people who love you would rather you didn't know. Secrets kept out of love can still cause damage, simply because unprocessed truth doesn't disappear. It just waits, silently, for the moment it can no longer be contained. If you take one thing away from my story, let it be this. The version of your life you're currently living might not be the complete version. And sometimes, the most painful days, the ones that feel like endings, like the collapse of everything you thought you understood, are actually the days that finally crack open the truth you were always meant to know. My divorce was the ending of one chapter. But it was also, unexpectedly, the beginning of understanding exactly where I came from, who my family really was, and what it cost the people before me to give me the ordinary, quiet life I almost took for granted. It's been almost 2 years now since that phone call in the courthouse parking lot, and I want to tell you honestly where things stand, because I think you deserve the real ending, not a neatly packaged one. My relationship with my mother is different now, not perfect, not entirely healed, but different in a way that feels more honest than anything we had before. We talk about her childhood sometimes, in pieces, on her terms. I've learned not to push, and she's learned, slowly, that I'm not going anywhere just because the truth turned out to be complicated. There are still things she doesn't tell me, and I've made peace with that. Some truths belong entirely to the person who lived them, and respecting that boundary is its own form of love. I stayed in touch with Dominic for a while after the funeral, mostly out of a strange sense of obligation to the only living connection I had to that entire chapter of family history. Those conversations eventually faded, the way most connections built around a single dying man's final wishes tend to fade once the immediate reason for staying in contact is gone. I don't think that's a tragedy. I think it's simply what happens when a bridge has served its purpose. As for the divorce that started all of this, Rachel and I are, believe it or not, on decent terms now. Enough time has passed that the wounds have scarred over into something manageable. She doesn't know the full story of what happened in the months after our papers were finalized, and for a long time, I wasn't sure I'd ever tell her. I eventually did, over coffee, almost a year later, mostly because keeping it from her started to feel like exactly the kind of protective secrecy that had cost my own family so much. She listened, she cried a little, and she told me something I still think about. I'm glad something good came out of the worst day of your life. I think that's about as generous a thing as a person can say to someone they used to be married to, and I've never forgotten it. I think about Salvatore often, more than I expected to for a man I only knew for 4 months. Not with uncomplicated love, and not with uncomplicated anger either, with something more honest than both of those simpler feelings. I think about the choices that shaped him, the world that trained him to believe silence was safety, and the daughter he loved enough to let go of, even though letting go turned out to be its own kind of harm. I don't know if that makes him a good man who did terrible things, or a terrible man capable of real love. I've stopped needing that question to have a single answer. I don't regret finding out. Even with everything that came with it, the fear, the complicated grief, the uncomfortable truths about a family history soaked in choices I would never make myself. I don't regret it. Because now, at least, the story I carry is a true one. And there is a kind of peace in that, even when the truth is heavy. I think a lot about the word family now, and how differently I understand it than I did before all of this happened. I used to think of family as a fixed, simple thing. The people who raised you, the people who share your blood, a category with clean edges. Now I understand it as something messier and more layered than that. Family is also the stories that get told and the ones that get buried. It's the fear a parent carries so quietly you mistake it for personality. It's the decisions made 2 generations before you were born that somehow still shape the shy way you flinch at unexpected knocks on your own front door, decades later, for reasons you never consciously learned. I also think differently now about endings. I used to believe a divorce was simply a failure, 2 people who couldn't make something work, closing a door on a chapter that didn't turn out the way they'd hoped. I still think there's grief in that, real grief that deserves to be honored and not rushed past. But I no longer believe endings are only endings. Sometimes they're the exact pressure that finally cracks open a door you didn't even know was sealed shut, revealing a room full of truth that had been waiting, patiently, for you to be ready to walk through it. If there's one image from this entire experience that I keep returning to, it's not the phone call, and it's not even the hospital room at the very end. It's a quieter moment, a few weeks after the funeral, when my mother and I sat together at her kitchen table, going through an old shoebox of photographs Salvatore had left specifically for her. Pictures from before she was born, pictures of a young Salvatore and a young woman who would become my grandmother, laughing at some joke lost to time, decades before any of the choices that would eventually fracture their family had been made. My mother held one photograph for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, quietly, almost to herself, "I never knew he used to smile like that." 50-some years of her own life, and there was still a version of her father she had never gotten to see, hidden in a shoebox, waiting for a moment neither of us could have predicted. That's what secrets do, in the end. They don't just hide the painful things. They hide the whole person, the laughter along with the fear, the tenderness along with the danger. When my mother finally saw that photograph, she wasn't just learning a new fact about her father's past. She was recovering a small, human piece of him that the silence had stolen from her for half a century. So let me ask you the same question I've been asking myself for months now. If a stranger called you tomorrow and told you your entire family history was built on a lie designed to protect you, would you want to know the truth? Or would you rather keep living inside the comfortable version you've always believed? I'd genuinely love to know your answer. Drop it in the comments below, because I read every single one, and these conversations are honestly the best part of sharing stories like this. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about family, secrets, or the people we think we know completely, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who might need to hear it. Subscribe if you want more real, emotional, deeply human stories like this one, because there are more waiting. And if you know someone who's ever felt like their family history doesn't quite add up, someone who might see a piece of themselves in this story, go ahead and share it with them. Thank you for staying until the very end. Stories like this only mean something when someone's actually listening. And you were. I'll see you in the next one.